we got drywall going up today. These guys are not playing around. Pretty efficient as far as how they execute their skill set, and they have a pretty decent team today here. Roughly around 4 or 5 people. I guess that's enough to get as much drywall that they've gotten up today up. It's not even 2 o'clock yet, and these guys are rocking and rolling. So, but yeah, it's pretty exciting to see these rooms go from skeleton to actually having flesh in a way, right? With the drywall being installed.
Alrighty, so we are in the 3rd floor corner unit, and this is where we started drywalling this morning. So we got about 5 or 6 drywallers on site right now, and they're just going to town with hanging drywall. A lot of times drywallers will have different ways that they like to do things. These guys seem to be hanging ceilings first, and then they'll hang some of the walls down, and then they'll be done with this room until they do the same for all the units on this floor. And then they'll come back, because none of them have to wear stilts when they come back in, and then they'll just bang out the rest of it. And another reason why sometimes they'll hold off on certain walls is if there's a lot of cuts that they have to make in the drywall, they'll kind of hold off on that stuff. Anywhere they can get a full sheet of drywall in, that's usually they'll hang it. But if they can't, then they'll do the next unit and the next one and the next one, and then they'll come back to this and make all their cuts then. So that's kind of how it goes. From here, we'll get something called a screw inspection from the city. They'll basically inspect the hanging of the drywall, and then we'll come in and tape. We'll do like it's a tape for the joints. It's fire resistant, and then after that tape is done, then we'll use drywall mud for over the top of that tape and also over all the screw heads. And then once that's done, they'll sand it down and it's ready for primer.
So what do they look for in terms of like the inspection of like the drywall screws?
So depending on where the drywall is inspected, whether it's the ceiling or the walls, there's usually something called a UL rating in the plans. So the plans call out a specific UL for the walls and the ceilings, and when you dig into those UL specifications, there is a spec that you have to have screws, 8 inches apart, 12 inches apart, whatever it might be, but then you have to follow that UL rating, and then that inspector comes in and looks for that, basically to make sure that the screws are 8 inches, whatever, which this particular one is supposed to be 8 inches, so they'll have to come back and hit a few of these spots. Overall, they're actually pretty good. They've done a pretty good job with it. So, and again, usually the 8 inches on center is in the middle here, because you'll notice that these screws on the perimeter are a little further away. Well, that's because our studs are 16 inches on center, so they have to hit those studs. But then when they come in the middle, then they can, have them closer to each other when it runs a certain direction, if that makes sense. It can be a little confusing. So a big component of like mud and tape will be stuff like this. So you'll notice they've kind of there's certain areas where the drywall's not as tight as it could be. Well, that's going to get made up and taken care of once they install their taping and they install all their mudding. This will look obviously like a finished product. So here we're looking at one side of the wall has been drywalled, and a big thing that drywallers sometimes, I wouldn't say have a hard time with, but they struggle because they like to go fast, is they either miscut an opening for something like a penetration. So what we have here is a sprinkler head, and it penetrates both sides of the stud wall. So these drywallers will have to cut around it to allow for that sprinkler head to be, functional and pop out that side. So you'll notice kind of over here that we'll swing around here, but so the drywallers, they cut their hole for this sprinkler head, but they cut it a little high, and so they kind of pushed that sprinkler head cap up a little bit so that they wouldn't have to recut it. But they're trying to go fast, but they are going to have to either recut that hole to allow that to stick straight out instead of up at an angle, or they're going to have to replace this piece. But that's how these things go. So my big thing with drywall right now is I'm checking to make sure that they're not covering any outlets or any any basically light sconces or anything like that, because last thing we want is to have to go and dig for something that got covered up 2 weeks ago. So they've been pretty good so far. You'll notice the foreman for the drywall guys has kind of spray painted some markings in the wall. That's how they keep track of, hey, we need to make a cut around certain things. So the drywallers installed 3 sides of this shaft with our 2-hour rated, which is actually 4 layers of drywall. But unfortunately, they can't get into the shaft and drywall the 4th side of what would be a wall here. So instead, we're using something called a shaft wall barrier. It's a pre-manufactured wall that's specifically made for shafts. So when you drywall 3 sides, then you just lean this 4th panel in, and that gives you the rating on all 4 sides. So instead of having to get in here and drywall a frame side, they pre-make the wall with metal studs and an inch thick drywall, and then they just lean it right up in there. Now obviously we have to have all of our duct and everything run before that happens, but that's why we've taken out the framing that was initially here. It technically wasn't even supposed to be installed, but a lot of times when we get to the drywall portion of the job, there's a lot of mess in these units, whether it's insulation pieces, whether it's cut up lumber, piping, just a bunch of miscellaneous trash that really shouldn't. We have to clean out the building every once in a while. So one of the best things to do is to clean out a unit or a floor right before the next big trade comes in. The reason why is you can keep these guys accountable for their scope of work. When this place is clean, now I know exactly who I need to go to make sure that it stays like this after a certain contractor comes in. So now I know that if there's any mess in any of these units, I know exactly who I'm going to. I'm going to those drywallers, and it's like, hey, clean your stuff up, get it out. It needs to look as good as you came into it, because this is a very clean site. These guys have the entire floor to themselves. There's no reason why this should be a mess once they're complete. Okay, so right now we're on the 1st floor area. We're working on our HVAC roof, which you can see some of the spiral duct here. This duct is specifically meant to be exposed to the open space. It's called a spiral duct, slightly more expensive, but also more appealing to the eye, and again, meant to be exposed. And then also you see some of the black piping running along the top here. That is all fire suppression. What they'll end up doing with this is they'll run something called an interstitial head up into the ceiling above the fire rated lid, and that sprinkler system will actually cover that gap between the drywall and then the floor above. So what that means is there's a lot less requirement from a fire stopping perspective, because there's sprinkler heads up in that space. And then of course there's sprinkler heads that'll drop down to accommodate this open space here. Eventually, when there's a tenant and there's some plans for that build out, that tenant will specify if he wants to have a drop ceiling or not. If he does, then a quote will be included in whatever price that is to drop the heads lower and meet that drop ceiling height requirement, and feed the area down here with a fire suppression system.